Professor Raktima Bhuyan teaches at the Department of English, Tezpur University. Her co-authored monograph, Print Modernity in Colonial Assam, 2023, is with Lexington Books. Her research interests are visual culture, gender medicine, and book history. And the title for today's talk is Menstruating Women in a Man's World, Print, Gender, and Women's Health in Colonial Assam. Um, Over to you, ma'am. I'm really sorry for the delay, but let's.
Good evening, everyone. I'll start right away by talking about, of course, what I'm going to present today. The title, as you see, is Menstruating Women in a Man's World, Print Gender and Women's Health in Colonial Assam. I'll focus on texts. I'll speak about a few texts for about 40 minutes, and then I expect some feedback from you. This is a work in progress, so it would be really happy to get questions and feedback after the 40 odd minutes of presentation. I'll start right away. In the literature of colonial Assam, ranging from poetry, both oral and written, in terms of transmission, to non-fiction, ranging from manuals and primers to isolated essays, the many products of print, among its other fixations, center stage to women's health and well-being. I begin this talk with a focus on these writings as elaborate accounts which perpetuated the Victorian misunderstandings regarding women's bodies, often documenting them as frail, weak, and prone to health issues. Health in colonial Assam was a moniker for reproductive health in women, and most women in colonial Assam, by this limited and sexist understanding of the term, were unwell. The focus was to make them healthy women, women who could produce healthy babies and prove as worthy women. Worthy woman again was a moniker for good mothers. I take a few texts published in the late 19th century and early 20th century Assam to propose how print disseminated notions on women's body and how its male practitioners propagated sexist assumptions on women's health. In the process, the latter category perpetrated the Victorian assumptions of women being the naturally weaker and inferior sex. It would be useful to consider two medical idioms which these two categories adhered to in the products of print during this time. One derived from Ayurvedic knowledge traditions and the other relying on Western medical frameworks of understanding. These models were clearly reflected in the author's choice of medical topics, notions about health, conceptions of the body, and ideas of disease causation. However, a common thread in these male writers on women's health was the emphasis on the important role of Indian women in the National Body Project as protectors, once appropriately educated, of the health of their families and thereby the health of the nation. The women, as these texts underline, emerge as wellness projects towards a healthy nation in general. There was a category of writings which intended to reveal the darkest recesses of the female body and revel in such knowledge by subjecting women to endless restrictions, beginning from movement to food when they begin to menstruate. Geraldine Forbes, as you see in the slide here, divides the spokespersons for women's issues in the 1880s into three categories: colonial authorities, Indian males in positions of authority, and British women doctors. I am interested here in the second group, males in position of authority, to highlight the readings of women's issues and acting as agents to perpetuate an already gendered existence for the women there. This category of writings can be argued as masculine, and I use the term here in the sense Susan Bordeaux uses, not as a biological category, but a cognitive style, an epistemological stance in cognizance with prevailing misogyny. In a work named Stree Chikitsa, for example, by Rupeswar Devaharma, the writer lists a number of illnesses which women are prone to. He, however, begins the text by highlighting the necessity of women in a section by the name, "Without women, one cannot produce sons, and without sons, you cannot land in heaven." The function of women hence is reduced to her reproductive ability, and a sense of accomplishment is associated with the birth of sons. Her libido, considered by the author to be 4 times more than that of a man, is misdirected to waywardness and frivolity by education. He therefore suggests limited education that would ensure modesty and obedience in women. Hence, Horma's maternal goddesses would also be the ideal feminine in outlook and aspirations, obeying the evolutionary principle of dependence on men. Also given is a checklist for an ideal woman. Her breasts should not be set too far apart, her waist should be thin, her hips wide. The women to be avoided are ones with dimples on their cheeks, the ones too hairy or completely hairless. The parameters of perfection established, Horma then focuses on the curse of menstruation. In his analysis, menstruating women should regulate their behavior in the first 4 days, especially. Nobody should touch them, and if they do, they would need to undergo purification. Even objects that the menstruating woman touches needs to be purified. The interesting spin to pollution associated with menstruation in this work is that the rules are different according to the caste identities of the women as well as the caste identities of the one she touches. The rules would be more rigorous for upper caste women in this case. There is hardly any material written by women on her own experiences of menstruation. Hence, menstruation garnered the connotations of unwellness, a tricky period during which women should be more controlled than they actually are, already are. These assumptions were not peculiar to Assam. There is a whole 19th century masculine epistemology on menstruation. You can see it, you can just read through the last point in the slide there. Of how notions where unwellness were premised in a woman's conduct, failing which she would be condemned to hysteria. It is no surprise then that Sri Cikitsa suggests disavowal of all pleasurable things and hence endorses simple food like rice for menstruating married women and fruits for menstruating widows. What is more interesting is apparently conducive diet rules during menstruation vary according to one's marital status again. Of special notice is how this brand of writings declare newer code to be adhered to once a girl starts menstruating. So menstruation is all things bad and foul and everything, but for the first menstrual cycle, which is termed menarche, is the most dangerous. Sri Cikitsa, which translates into treatment or cure for women, lists a number of women's diseases and offers treatment like its title suggests. These women's diseases range from fear or anxieties about sharing bed with one's husband to menopause. Since a woman's life centers around her reproductive capacity in these writings, menopause is not seen as a physiological stage or event but a disease, and treatment involving herbs and plants suggested for the same. As regards the analysis and readings of menopause, it was considered as a loss and pathology for a long time in history, like Eleanor Cleghorn suggests, and I'm just going to quote her. For centuries, the demise of a woman's fertility had been regarded as an illness that disturbed the body and deranged the mind. With their biological and social purpose coming to an end, menopausal women historically have been vilified as dangerous and useless. Another text, Adarho Swasthya Samasar by Guluksandra Horma Bordoloi, too intrudes into the private sphere of menstruating women, and his frontier here is the first menstruation, which he supposes occurs at around 13 to 14 years in young girls. Citing it as the most critical event that determines the future health of the girl as well as her children at a later stage in her life, he advises on announcing the event instead of keeping quiet. This is important so that all those customary impositions could be put in action right straight away without exposing oneself to forbidden behavior like being out and about, smiling, and having fun. Indulging in these activities during the attainment of puberty, Bordoloi warns, leads one to conceive thin, weak, ill children at a later stage. The rules to observe among many are enumerated thus: avoid glancing at men older than 10 years of age, live on a fruit diet, preferably for the first 4 days, refrain from stepping out of the house, not conjure vulgar thoughts into one's mind, or laugh and gossip about with one's friends. The most striking rules, however, are the direct reproductive outcome of indulging in daily activities. To cite a few, bathing is prohibited during the first 4 days. Rubbing off grime from one's body would result in your child being a drunkard. Brushing your teeth or oiling would entail skin infections for the child. Putting coal, as in kajal, would make your child blind. The first menstruation hence prescribed doing away with day to day hygiene, already reaffirming the picture of menstruation as a scourge. Jyoti Puri makes a careful observation of the constant need to and consequent marketing of menstruation through the reconstitution of the female body as a non hygienic, odorous body that can be aestheticized with the use of cosmetics and disposable rather than reusable collectors of menstrual uh, discharge. Hence, the ever popular advertisement of and subscription to perfumed sanitary pads for those days of the month that we see in both in print and television ads. It is important to consider here where this text came into, because we are talking about healthcare and women. So, how did women figure in all of the in the narrative on Indian women's health? So, before Dufferin Fund, which was a fund introduced solely for the purpose of women, women figured in medical history in India only in terms of hospitals named lock hospitals, and these hospitals were established by the British government so that their soldiers would not be infected with sexually transmittable diseases from the prostitutes. So these lock hospitals were, of course, designed solely to censor prostitutes, check their health regularly, and keep them there locked up, as the title suggests, so that they could not spread whatever they were all scared of. They could not spread it to their British soldiers. Other than lock hospitals, there were no provisions until the Dufferin Fund to consider special medical knowledge and exclusive treatment meant for women. The Dufferin Fund in 1885 institutionalized gender as an important matrix in extending medical care to Indian women. Its roles were to extending, of course, medical care to women, providing scholarships for women who wanted to study medicine, and building hospitals that would cater to women's needs specifically. Was it successful? Though there was a dissonance between the promise of Western medical intervention and the possibilities of availing the same. Gangaram Das's Bodhya Amar, for instance, states that medical facilities were largely inaccessible to a greater section of the population. In the context of the relationship between colonialism and medicine in India, the introduction of Western biomedicine also unleashed inequity in health facilities. So, for example, see this analysis by Pratik Chakraborty between the disparity. In Assam, too, this followed suit. The larger section of the population were residing in villages where Western biomedicine wasn't commonplace. In addition to that, most of these people were illiterate. Bodhya Amar's claim that medical facilities were inaccessible to most of the population in colonial Assam has then to do with this inequity in distribution. Also, such propositions like difficulty in procuring locally available medicinal resources due to ignorance of the same made it incumbent, as the writer says, to write such a text which would prescribe an exhaustive list of medicines for an equally exhaustive list of diseases. These alternative medical practices rooted in the indigenous systems were important for a poverty-wrenched population, of course, but also owing to difficulty in communicating health issues because of embarrassments and reservations associated with certain illnesses, most definitely anything related to a woman's physiology. Prohuti, for instance, published in 1897, states an apology for having to use terms which might be considered obscene and foul. The supposed obscenity, as the reader discovers, is associated with description of the reproductive system and mention of terms such as uterus, fallopian tube, ovaries, menstruation as they stand without any innuendos. This disclaimer is rooted in the discomfort in talking about women's bodies in particular and the general tendency of similar discomfort about addressing it to a medical professional. In a section titled Child Welfare and Indigenous Dhai, Matri Mongol by Lolit Kumar Borua provides statistics of the birth and death rates of newborns in London and of course Calcutta, because Calcutta was a frequent reference point in everything that was written in Assam during that time. In London, for instance, for every 1,000 newborns, 100 do not survive, and in Calcutta, which has more availability of doctors and dhais than Assam, the number of deaths per thousand is 310. The writer hence draws the conclusion that the figures can be assumed to be staggering in Assam, which was much backward from Calcutta in terms of medical facilities and healthcare. Such deaths and health hazards after childbirth are attributed to ill-trained and ignorant dhais, lack of hygiene and care. As a list of ill practices, the act of cutting the umbilical cord of a child with bamboo stick, use of dust and dirt to stop the mother's bleeding, etc. are cited. Such practices make the child a potent ground for tetanus, and due to the parents' ignorance, they are assumed to be possessed, and then different kinds of charms and magical spells are used on those children. As possible solutions to such malpractices, Borua pleads the numbered doctors in rural Assam to conduct appropriate training for the dhais. He, however, suggests that this would necessitate a sacrifice of their self-interest, but that would again aid the nation's development in the long run. The child here is seen as the foundation of a slowly developing nation, and hence it is incumbent that the mother is provided with the best conditions, mentally and physically, to deliver healthy offsprings. Now, since all of these texts were written directed towards women's health, it would be significant to analyze the unique role of women themselves as consumers of the products of print. The oral culture in Assam and the manuscript tradition already acquainted the demography in colonial Assam with the literature of the soil and kept the storytelling tradition thriving. Ulrich Stark makes a distinction between literacy and literacy awareness to denote the sensibility of the Indian public during the pre-colonial and colonial times. This distinction draws upon C. A. Bailey's argument in Empire and Information, which suggests that even if the society was largely non-literate, it was still a society acutely aware of literacy, where even the poor could gain access to the writers and readers at a cost, and where illiteracy did not preclude sophistication in using others' learning. While medicine is considered to be a creative act characterized by being inclusive and emergent, there is a special text here which is Kutika Potol, a translation by Govindaram Sodhuri of a Bengali text. This is an alternative rendering of medicine as a creative act. One's experience and knowledge are invited by the imagination to create a new mode of understanding and doing. The medical practitioner here is replaced by the translator, the patients by the listener audience. Since it would be impossible for the women audience to read such texts, he attunes it to their understanding and composes in verse what was originally rendered in prose. In biomedical practices, such inclusivity is essential to adapt to unique patients and situations. The translation and broadly the literary exercise takes cognizance of the unique readership vis-a-vis literary awareness of the audience. Hutika Potol, among other handbooks written on women's health in colonial Assam, stands as a piece that made instructions on health accessible and created a literacy awareness where women could participate in an oral culture and note the precautions and preventions to be taken for a healthy life. The text, as I said, is a translation of Jodunath Mukherjee's Dhatri Hikha. The translator, however, accomplished the work for his readers in Assam by translating it into Kamrupi Bhasha and favoring the pre-modern verse instead of Ohomia or standard Assamese. That is to say that women or prospective mothers had access to it as a listener audience who would memorize and internalize the do's and don'ts during pregnancy, all thanks to a text which was written in a tone that favored the colloquial rather than the elite and the standardized. Health and care are often conceived in non-detachable terms, and women mostly are supposed to be the natural caregivers in their roles as mothers, wives, and daughter-in-laws. Texts like Hutika, Prahuti, Matrimongol, etc. acknowledge the difficult and multiple roles which women undertake and how she should be exempted from overbearing tasks during pregnancy. Embedded in an oral rhetoric, Hutika could well make men and women alike aware about the care to be invested in women who are conceiving children. They could gain access to readers and writers at a cost, the cost here being listening to the recitation of texts. The ignorance, illiteracy, poverty, all considered at once, necessitated readings and dissemination of these texts for the sole purpose of centering women's health, for the development of the overall family, and consequently the whole nation. This, it can be asserted, was a colonial project. The original text, as well as the translated part, deals with specifications of the concerned architecture of the house where a pregnant woman lives, and Sodri takes certain liberties here in order to adapt it to the unique geography of his listener audience. Specific sections trace the evolution of medicinal practices from Asuraka, a practice associated with Asuras or savages or demons, to Nidana, practiced by the civilized and the Sabhya. These delineate as well as record the elements of Western biomedicine in late 19th century Assam. This is an exercise in literary marvel, no doubt. However, it grounds women's happiness on the event of reproduction, and specifically the birth of a male child. In a section titled Hontan Jonmot Tirutar Hukh, which translates into the happiness of childbirth, the woman's happiness and fulfillment are centered on the activities of childbirth. The sense of achievement is absent in women who cannot bear children, and her life is rendered miserable. Hence, practices like worshipping and fasting are prescribed to beget a male child, which would lead to her fulfillment as a woman and make the husband happy. It remains, however, as a singular instance of literary quality which imparts instructions on women's well-being simultaneously. In a curious inversion of responsibility and attribution to bear healthy children or to bear children at all from the woman, Kushokanto Kakoti in Prokhuti prescribes control and restraint to a man's sexual life rather than the woman, failing to do which one becomes impotent. He says, and I translate, both men and women are prone to impotence. Men who are abusive and lewd face loss of spermatozoa and hence rendered impotent. When the ovum of a woman cannot divide or is blighted, she cannot reproduce. The association of lewdness with a supposed loss of fertility is an aberration in a time when print placed the onus of bearing healthy children on the conduct of women as young girls stepping into adulthood. Taking into cognizance that while most of the writings of this period stressed on restrictions for women, Kakoti's handbook prescribes free movement and centers a woman's mental health and well-being for a safe delivery. I'd like to conclude on this note that with the reading of select texts and situating these within the events of the advent of print and colonialism in Assam, a few tendencies are clearly delineated. These range from a historical situation of women's health in colonial Assam, conjoined with the advent of Western biomedicine, onerous theories on menstruation and women's diseases related to that, the creation of different kinds of reading publics and literary awarenesses, and perpetuation of medical misogyny. Since the writers selected are male, the patriarchal anxieties either simmer or erupt in these pieces. In all of these instances, though, Western biomedicine as a new entry does not elicit feminist concerns and responses. With very little work done in terms of the intersection of gender and medicine in colonial Assam, the literature of the period can be read to understand much of the medical lore of the period with regards to women's health. Also striking is the upstaging of creativity to cater to various concerns during this period. I would like to end it here and look forward to your questions. And I would also like to acknowledge the fact that the texts that I have used for this presentation have all been accessed from the digital archive of the Department of Assamese, Tezpur University. Thank you.
So, yeah, I'm very sorry that I couldn't attend the first few minutes, and think there was a last minute emergency that I had to attend to. And but it's great that we have, quite a bit of time for discussion. So let me first make it possible for attendees to unmute themselves and also chat, so that in case they want to write down their questions in the chat box, that's a possibility. But of course, feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Though I missed the first part, it was a very interesting discussion, and I did have a few mostly clarifying questions, possibly coming from the fact that I was not there for the first few minutes. But maybe I'll hold on to them for a while and see if there are questions from the audience members first. And if they take some time to formulate their questions, I don't mind asking you a few. I think I see a raised hand. Yeah, please go ahead. You could unmute yourself and ask your question.
Uh, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Hi, Raktima. This is Vijitida, this side.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I'm not switching on my video. You at least can hear me. See, I was thinking, first of all, congratulations on your presentation. That was really amazing. And after having read your book, obviously, this is something really fascinating to sort of to follow up. So I was thinking when you were sort of outlining these different facets pertaining to women's health, I was wondering what were the responses of the early women reformers, 1920s and 30s, like people like Sundrapapa Hoikyani and others, and like the different Mohila committees when they were sort of going around, villages, sort of engaging with people. So what was the response of them, like vis-a-vis these practices, or were they trying in some way to raise awareness about women's health? So what was the situation like, in the immediate pre-independence period? So, and vis-a-vis the different women organizations in Assam? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your question. Dr. Sharma, I have had very limited accounts and I try to see it in the light of how women responded to it, of course, the question that you asked. I have had few references of it in Ghorjyoti in the past year that I have read about it, but of course this was a women's magazine. So even when the men wrote about women's health, they talked rather liberally of the women as opposed to when they were writing texts by themselves, publishing it by themselves. So they had this thought in their mind that this is for a women's magazine, so the editor is a woman. So they were talking rather rationally as opposed to the text which they wrote outside of the control of women. As regards women's responses, I have also seen little references to the first menstruation in, for example, Erioha Dinbur. That and the writer says that she discovered that her sister turned into an adult one fine day, and she did not understand what that was about, and then she was made to not play with the younger girls, and that is how she internalized this whole process, that once you step into puberty you are supposed to behave like an adult however young you are. So these were very story like descriptions rather than any scientific or rational understanding of the same. Menstruation was a taboo not just for these men writing about it, of course for the women themselves. And barring Ghor Jyoti, I haven't had any references to it or to women's health in general, where they were taken as rational physical beings rather than being treated as taboo. But that again we understand because this was headlined by women. This Ghorjyoti, I mean this magazine was headlined by women, so it is but obvious that they had to cater to the women's sensibilities. Yeah, that's it.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Right.
Yeah, thank you for that question. If I could quickly jump in and ask a couple of clarificatory questions, and I'm really sorry if you've already answered them in the first part of the talk that I missed, but I was just very curious about a couple of things there. So, one is this medical misogyny that you talk about. It's very interesting because on the one hand, at least on paper, we like to think that if a certain bioscientific rigor is attached to the process of menstruation, it will take it away from social taboo. I mean, that's how we like to think of it, right? Uh, just as certain parts of the body that might otherwise be culturally sexualized stop being sexual, at least on paper, when they become an object of scientific study. But on paper, very much on paper, right? So I'm just wondering, and I could be wrong because I was not there initially, but some of the texts, I guess, are written by doctors, right? Male doctors, medical doctors. Are there? No, no, these are not written by. Okay, so that actually clarifies the point. But I would still like to ask you, did you find any medical documents about menstruation in colonial Assam where, it could be male doctors or female doctors talking about it? And did you see any change then or a difference between these kinds of popular instruction manuals and a certain kind of medical text, let's say?
Hmm. Orko, what I did was I analyzed these texts, which are of course available, the Dufferin Fund reports. So one hurdle to understanding the actual condition of women, as in medically, is the absence of reports regarding Assam, except very small patches. I mean,
Mm,
there are elaborate accounts of what happened at Ludhiana, at Madras, at Bombay, but some little paragraph somewhere lost in the way, and that too also just mentioning the fact that it's very difficult to gain access to these people. It's very difficult. They resist vaccination. So it's very difficult to intrude into the spaces, and the rural urban divide was massive during the colonial period. And when we are talking about Assam, we are also talking about a very diverse geography. There are the
mm,
hills, there are the plains, there are all extremes. So, and we are also talking about a time when transport and communication had not made that kind of impact in this part of the world. So it doctors were basically not there, very
right.
limited. Maybe in
Mm,
Dibrugarh, Berry White Hospital, and when they introduced this DHAI training schemes, DHAI, so we call it DHAI here, DHAI training schemes. So it was only women from the apparently lower caste, what are usually considered as lower caste or the deprived. There is a record of one Kuli woman, one Naga woman who enrolled at Berry White Hospital and wanted to be trained as DHAIs. So, of course, nobody wanted to take up this profession. There were scholarships released. The women did not want to take it up. There are, of course, isolated instances. We have great doctors, but proper documentation of women as patients is missing because women did not go to hospitals.
mm,
They reframed
right.
them. And that is why the popularity of all of these books, they were so much in circulation, one after another, because everyone took it for granted that these people will never approach doctors. So, of course, there is, there will, all of this will be in circulation. And then maybe that way we can maybe spread the word. So,
Right.
of course, the documentation, proper documentation is missing.
Hmm.
Limited.
Hmm. Yeah, but this is very interesting, right? So there's a certain kind of medical culture that is built perhaps around the absence of a rigorous medical scientificity. And
Yeah.
that in itself is a very interesting, I suppose, historical moment we are talking about. I just wanted to push you a little bit on a couple of points just for my own, I suppose, curiosity. But if there is a question, I'll wait for that and then perhaps ask the next question. Uh, is there a question from the floor? Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak, or you can put it in the chat box if you want. I don't see anything in the chat box as of now. Okay, maybe I'll give it a minute for people to perhaps ask the next question. I can maybe ask my second question very quickly. So you mentioned it at a point, the let's say the coming into being of biomedicine, which is quite a Western phenomenon, right, in the context of colonial Assam. And you said that, if I heard you correctly, you said that it's not that biomedicine necessarily created a very feminist framework either, right? So I was just wondering, could you speak a little bit more about this sort of, on the one hand, we have this nexus. I mean, if we want to call it a nexus or maybe a relation between print modernity and colonialism. On the other hand, we have, and they're not at loggerheads, of course. On the other hand, we have a certain kind of Western biomedicine perhaps coming into India through the colonial science system. So the colonial science system, the print system, modernity, all of it, in a way, are coming together to form a certain kind of medical culture, right? Which is discriminatory and it's creating taboos as you pointed out. I'm just wondering what could be the role of biomedicine here, or was there any role it played beyond furthering the taboos? Because it seems like that's what it did, but I could be wrong. It'll be nice if you could talk a little bit more about this biomedicine angle, if you want.
Yeah, uh, of course, it did not maybe want to further the taboo, but by the advent of biomedicine can also be a very, I read it as a colonial project because this was this was a this was an area that nobody ventured into, as in a woman's bedroom was never talked of until that time. Once biomedicine came in, entered into colonial Assam, there were instructions on how clean the bed sheets of a pregnant woman need be. So they were intruding into these spaces, and of course, there was this enlightening mission that these people are uneducated as to the proper rules of health and hygiene. So the best way would be to intrude into those spaces which are never talked about. Right? So there are elaborate accounts on how you need to change the bed sheets of the women after they deliver a baby. And interestingly enough, people resisted from changing because they considered that whatever stain remained, that would pollute them. So, of course, the West was acutely aware of all of it. So, intrusion into the private spaces of women became a colonial project to highlight this need for enlightening the women, and vis-a-vis the women, the whole family, and that way it extended to the whole of society. So, these are, twin threads running with each other and cannot be really separated. Of course, it's very implicit, but it was there. It cannot be altogether negated. This women were very much in their imagination. Women's private spaces, and without any exaggeration, were very much in their imagination to accomplish the enlightenment project.
Hmm. So just follow up, what did that intrusion do to the taboo? Because I'm assuming, but please correct me if I'm wrong, there was a sense of taboo about menstruation or a lack of awareness that led to a taboo about menstruation in
Right.
men. And that I'm assuming, but as I said, I could be wrong, that could have existed before colonialism as well, right? So I'm just wondering, what is it that this intrusive civilizing project, oh, let me tell you how to do your health hygiene, coming from the colonial master, how did this change perhaps a sense of taboo that anyway existed in some other form? Or did it change anything? What would you say to that?
These taboos were mainly in a non-written form. With print, with biomedicine, it became solidified. So culture and taboos had as much a role to contribute to the medical lore of the period as whatever scientific writings were in circulation at that point of time. So the medical lore, when we talk about medicine, we talk about it in terms of science. So, but when we talk about medical lore here, taboos were taboos kind of solidified, and they were sanctioned into certain do's and don'ts, which are written down in print. So it's the man's word that makes all of this possible. And of course, I as you notice, I bracketed the L there because it's just, of course, it's in print, very limited material by women on their own body, so much material in circulation by men on women's bodies. So of course, of course, we are supposing that men know more about women's bodies than women do. So of course it's solidified. I see that, with this curious mixture, it solidified those taboos into more circulation, more rules, and more restrictions for women. Yeah, and
Great. Yeah. No, sorry, please add if you wanted to add something.
yeah.
Okay, great.
That was
So I'm hoping now that we have spent a few more minutes talking about things, perhaps there's a question ready. Okay, I think there's a question in the chat box from Anamika. Let me read it out to you, Raktima. Love the session. As you mentioned, the concept of hysteria was historically linked to menstruation and female bodies. How do you think this legacy has influenced the way women's pain and reproductive health are treated in modern medicine?
Of course, there is this unfair
No, no,
pinning down
go ahead,
women's,
please.
yeah, there is this unfair, pinning down of women's health, and everything is attributed to her uterus. So this is something that still exists. And I would like to, maybe you could just check, Anamika, an important work called Unwell Women, which could give you elaborate accounts of present day medical misogyny. Just proves that, of course, we have come centuries forward, but some part of it, as in, if you're feeling low, it's all because you have a uterus. So everything is, kind of attributed to your physiology, as in everything is there in the uterus. You possess that, so that is the root of all of your diseases. I cannot talk about specific accounts here, but Unwell Women could be a good point to start. Eleanor Cleghorn, of course, she talks about it specifically in terms of the West, but we could think about it in terms of what happens to our bodies and our discussions with medical professionals in everyday life.
Okay, thank you for that question. I think there's another question, right? It's from Nilakshi. Yeah, let me read it out just in case some people can't see the chat box. What do you think are some ongoing impacts of colonialism on women's health and well-being in Assam today? Also, can you tell us more about your co-authored monograph, Print Modernity in Colonial Assam? Yeah.
Yeah.
Raktima.
Hello, Nilakshi. Thank you for the question. In relation to what I presented, I can talk about my book, saying that my interest in women's health in colonial Assam started with that book, because I wrote a chapter on this specific issue, taking up one of the texts that I discussed today, Hutika Potol. So, of course, it goes back to that book. And about the impact of colonialism today in women's health, this need for sanitation, making ourselves smell good even when we are not at our best. Why do we go for perfumed sanitary napkins? So why do we want to smell nice and good when we are not smelling like ourselves, right? So of course, smelling like ourselves is not considered to be hygienic on certain days of the month. So we are still prescribing to that, and the widespread circulation and use of all of this stuff suggests that we still want to adhere to a colonial aesthetic of beauty and sanitization. Yeah, that's one minor point that I still see today. Thank you.
Okay, that's nice. It's nice to see questions coming up now. Right, let me maybe jump in and ask a question. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question? One was happy to take the question from the audience first. Okay, in case someone wants to write in the chat box, I'll just give them some more time and maybe ask a very basic curiosity question. So, Raktima, you did talk about literary creativity and how some of these texts had a certain literary flavor, I suppose, a certain kind of rhetoricity and so on. I'm just wondering what the function of that literariness would do to their misogyny. I mean, did it actually ramp up the misogyny, improve it in a certain way by making it more literary or, in some sense, perhaps rhetorically beautiful? Or is it that the literary effect went against the medical misogyny?
No, no. Of course, it made people aware about certain things like women need to be taken care of. When I'm talking about this specific text named Hutika Pottle, of course, brilliant, literary marvel and excellent attempt at translation, excellent attempt at making it available in a form which would be which could be used by a women audience, which was a basically listener audience. But then the end point of it was all that, women who produce children are successful, accomplished, and then the kind of griefs that women are made to feel when they cannot produce male children. All of these things are reasserted there, and it was just talking about things in a rhythmic form, because it was all verse. So of course, it would be made available for the listener audience, and then perhaps reaffirmed the misogyny in beautiful terms, not taking away the element of care, because until then, what we take to be so commonplace now, as in a pregnant woman needs to be taken care of, was not said until then in print. So, of course, that was a kind of step up, but then it ended with the fact that, happiness associated primarily with childbirth. Your failure as a woman if you fail to produce one. So, of course, reaffirmed.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Question? Yeah, I think there's a question. I don't know the name. I'm sorry. iPad is not a name. It was an amazing session. In your session, you mentioned how the caste identities of women had a distinct impact on the amount of leverage they were able to exercise in society as human beings. Taking from that and talking about the issue of hygiene and sanitization that comprise such an important part of caste-based discrimination, how did it impact the sanitation procedures during menstruation and pregnancy of women of various castes? Could you please elaborate on that? Yeah.
Yeah. So the rules were thus laid out. If a menstruating woman touched somebody from the lower caste, they could purify themselves just by taking a bath. If a menstruating woman touched a man or a woman from an upper caste, they had to undergo a whole ritualistic purification with tulsi and all kinds of purifying water. So the rules were more stringent for the upper caste males and females alike. It was assumed that anyway you are an impure person if you belong to a lower caste, so you do not need to undergo rigorous steps of purification. But if you're an upper caste male or female, you are up there already very pure. So you need the steps of purification need to be really elaborate. That was it. Of course, caste was an important factor there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. Thank you, Seema, for the responses. It's very illuminating. Okay. Yeah. Is there another question? I mean, feel free to unmute and speak. It'll be nice to hear your voices. I mean, it's fine to get questions on chat, but if you want, you can always speak. Is there a question? Okay, Nuruddin has a question. I just wanted to ask if you found a distinction between scientific versus non-scientific narratives about women's bodies in the texts you analyzed.
Um, Yes, of course. The scientific part of it in limited texts like Boydom or Prohuti, etc., were the first of its kind to speak about women's body parts as they were, like I said, without innuendos. And the non-scientific writings, of course, were certain kind of manuals and rule books rather than appropriate, proper study of biology. Those were mainly rule books handed out by men towards women and to make them more confined and limited in their movements, everyday movements and life in general. Yeah.
Thank you for that question and your answer. I just wanted to ask maybe a quick question here as others gather their thoughts, and we have perhaps a few more questions. Uh, so this point about odor and attached to shame, the idea of obscenity, foulness. I was thinking about these sort of sensorial things that are seemingly quite dominant in these texts, right? Uh, I'm just wondering, what does it say about the way, uh, I mean, of course, one could associate smell with caste as well. It has been done by Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukkai, where they talk about smell and the sociology of smell in Cracked Mirror too. But I was generally thinking about the menstrual taboo and how the menstrual taboo, as you say, it gets formalized in a way. It gets formalized through print mechanism, right? Um, Again, it's a question about the readership, I suppose, if it is known to some extent, of these texts. And, you know, not just about the target audience, of course, about the target audience, but also, it goes back, I think, to the first question that was asked, whether women had a certain kind of counter response to perhaps this discourse, because they would have seen the misogyny, right? At least a certain section of women who are able to read and understand, maybe not every single woman, cutting across literacy barriers, but do we know anything from the archives or from whatever available narratives we have about the readership of these books and what kind of impact they made in terms of the menstrual taboo? Because they are clearly solidifying it, as you said. But was there a sort of voice or at least an acknowledgement that there is misogyny in these texts, perhaps coming from women readers, female readers?
Yeah. Like like Dr. Dhurjyoti Horma suggested, he was talking about Mohila Samiti and Sondra Prabha Soikyani, of course, being one of the vanguards of that movement, of the Mahila Samiti movement in Assam. There are references to restrictions uh, without direct references to restrictions vis-a-vis menstruation. So when she talks about perhaps women being always confined, there are higher chances that she was talking about women being confined most times, most days of the month within their houses. So this we cannot analyze feminist revolution in Assam uh, by comparing it to what happened to the West. It was a slow process here because stepping out was a challenge. We are talking about it in terms of being intertwined with the nationalist movement. So when the Mahila Samiti stepped in, they encouraged women to move out. That could also possibly be, taking charge of both the social domains rather than being restricted only to the domestic sphere. Menstruation was not never talked about in explicit terms in these limited writings that I have read, but they always endorsed about women stepping out, and that I think was had to do in little or big ways about women being confined by one taboo or the other. So of course, very, very implicit, but then with stepping out was a challenge. And that all of these writings, of course, endorsed at that point of time. No direct references as such, except the one autobiography that I was talking about, that sudden realization that your sister has changed. And then the parents stopped her from playing. Of course, the writer finds it very unfair and unfortunate. She cannot imagine the fact that the girl who was playing with them until yesterday suddenly mutates into a space where she no longer will have access to that. And it's only voiced in terms of frustration, but not clearly, hinting at taboo or, a certain revolution vis-a-vis, a voice against all of these restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, it's always this strange patriarchal paradox, I suppose. On the one hand, there is this championing of reproductive capacity of women as their only value, as it were. On the other hand, there is this obscenity generated around menstruation, without which there is no pregnancy and there's no reproduction either. So it's a strange kind of paradox. Anyway, I think we have a question here, so let us move on to that. Smaranika has a question. Uh, Not a question, but just an observation. But I'm going to read it out anyway. Roktima, you might want to respond to it if you have a response to this. Uh, an observation that basically this medical discourse on women's health and sexuality is just another discourse of power play if we go by what Foucault argues in volume 3 of the history of sexuality. And even today, in the 21st century, such medical discourse seems to undermine women's pleasure and agency over their bodies, I feel. Like, for instance, a woman's degree of sexual desire is also often related to their menstrual cycle. Would you like to say something to this?
Yeah, of course, because zero reference to what a woman wants, right? In all of the texts that I talked about, of course, very much, downplaying her own sexuality, or her own being or her own agency in that sense. So, of course, I very much agree to what she says. Of course, this is a discourse of power, and mind you, when these men were writing books, they already knew that not many women would be able to read it. It would be an upper class intellectual elite men who would have access to this text. So, it would be very much among them to make new rules, and of course, subject the women at their homes, outside of their homes, to all of this, right? So of course it's a power discourse. Yeah. Thank you for the observation, though.
Yeah, I mean it's this extremely not bizarre, but at the same time, it's because it's very real. It's not bizarre, but a very crazy situation with some men writing books where they're talking to men about women's
About
health.
women, and my God, menopause being treated as a disease. There is a writer actually saying that, if you take all of these herbs and things, you will start, menstruating again, because that's supposed to be an aberration. That's vilified men, and that's very, very recent. Menopause being vilified is a very until
Yeah.
very recently. So there's still so much research going on in terms of menopause.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of continuity. I mean, that's coming out in the questions and your responses too. It's not that we're talking about a thing of the past. The menstrual taboo very much continues in modern India in different forms, right? I just wanted to have a very quick kind of query on a similar point. Do we know much about these male writers and their backgrounds, and what prompted them to write books like this? So, I mean, and what was their source of knowledge, if at all, or source of ignorance, if I may say? But what were they consulting? How did they come to write these books?
they just put down in these were really group of clever men who were just writing down things they had heard all their lives. Mind you, all of them are upper caste male. Golok
Yeah.
Sondra, um, yeah. There is a Devoharma, there is a Goswami. So all of these are, Brahmin men. And of course, ignorance and knowledge, whatever, whatever terms you want to refer to it, where I don't think any book on science would deal with these things the way these men are. So there is a Horma Bordoloi. Yeah. So these are all, you are asking about the identities, these are all upper caste men.
Yeah, why am I not surprised? And yeah, Shreya says mansplaining. I remember in one of our earlier conversations when this talk was being planned, you said that it's a talk about mansplaining. So I think, I mean, of course, the particular term wasn't there, I suppose, in colonial Assam, but it's very interesting how there's a terminology for this, which kind of makes it a little bit more precise, I suppose, what we are talking about. Right. We have another question, Rima. I would love to hear your thoughts on the rise of capitalism and its impact on menstruating women in colonial Assam.
Uh, Capitalism, I would not, in colonial Assam, it would be difficult to put it that way. This was still a nation developing, struggling with its own issues. There were the nationalist struggle was at the forefront at that point of time. I don't think capitalism had so much a role to play here as, modernity as an enlightenment project. If you're talking about biomedicine and intruding into the private spaces of women, it was more about, enlightening the people and already assuming that these are a group of really dumb people, so we need to put in some sense into them. So it was more so an intrusion of an attempt at enlightening. And what about this term capitalism, I think that stepped in much later, and still it's still really relevant when I talk about all of this menstrual hygiene products. There is a specific way of marketing these things. So yeah, there are sanitization products which women do not need, and there are still all of these products available. For example, any intelligent gynecologist would uh, warn against using all of these hygiene products because we have a self cleansing mechanism, but these objects are marketed so much so already, affirming the fact that you don't smell the way you should. So you are not as clean as you are supposed to be. So of course these are all capitalist tendencies and marketing strategies, and these are more visible now than the time we are talking about here. Thank you for the question, though.
Okay, do we have a last question? I'm just aware of time, and if there is a last question, please feel free to. If there's a long question and it's too difficult to write it down, please feel free to speak and articulate your question if you would like to. Maybe I'll give it a few seconds. If there's, I don't see a raised hand, but if there's someone who, I mean, you don't necessarily have to raise a hand. You can just unmute and speak if you like. Okay. It seems like we don't have any further questions. Right, there is one from Arundhati that goes, can you talk about the newer menstrual products and the taboo about virginity? And there is another question, but maybe I'll just, yeah, why don't you, if you want to talk about that, Raktima, why don't you just take that
Yeah,
first?
I see that there is a change from what was earlier suggested. You need to use products which cannot be reused, as in we have seen the transition from sanitary pads to menstrual cups now. So there is a breakage of the taboo, because the idea was that once you use something, you need to throw it away. It gets so impure. So the entire concept of sanitary pads was started with that idea that you need to dispose of that. So menstrual cups coming in, of course, kind of breaks that taboo, that what you use for once does not become polluted or needs to be discarded. So yeah, that's a very recent development. I don't think it's as popular until now, but it's slowly gaining more popularity. And we have instances of women endorsing these products, one time buy, and then you just buy it and then use it for years together. So this is a getting away from the taboo of what is once used needs to be discarded. Yeah. And virginity, of course, all of these rules were made for women, starting from the first menstruation. Do not glance at a man older than 10 years of age. Of course, does not say that, talk about virginity as such, but that was the way of refraining oneself from exploring oneself, or exploring her sexuality, or even getting in touch with somebody, to increase the barrier so much that you are even scared of talking somebody, so let alone thinking of other things in life, right? So virginity as a term wasn't mentioned, but this continuous insistence of not refraining from seeing somebody, smiling with somebody, however bizarre it sounds, but those were rules laid out, and there are records of all of this. So yeah, it was very much there, and whatever restrictions were posed on, like I said from the beginning, women's menstruation cannot be seen as an isolated zone here, at least in terms of Assam. It had direct repercussions, according to these people, on her reproductive cycle. So it cannot be read in isolation. Menstruation, observe all of these rules, good children, healthy children. So it was as plain as that. So these things get entangled in all of these narratives during the time we are talking about, and available in these writings. Thank
Right.
you.
There are two more questions, and let's take them. And there's perhaps, okay, right. So Shreya asks, what is the environment at Anganwadis in Assam in relation to female menstruation and reproductive hygiene? And if I may just quickly couple the second question with this, I was curious if there were also accounts on women hygiene and health by the missionaries in Assam. That's the second question. So Anganwadis and missionaries, right?
The Anganwadis, and these are limited to schools. Of course, there are provisions of making toilets cleaner, encouraging people to use high quote unquote hygiene products, but then anyway uh, increasing some amount of familiarity with all of these products that are there in the market. Most of these people do not even have access to sanitary pads. So once somebody steps into the school, all of these communities come in, making young girls aware of all of these alternative methods which might just be used. So this is one way the Anganwadi steps in. Missionary accounts of I might be wrong. I have not explored everything that exists, but I'll confine myself to speaking about the Dufferin Fund specifically, because it's a specific document which has to deal with women's health. The fund was introduced specifically for women. So if that report lacks appropriate account of women's issues, or the number of women patients or whatever, or lack of access, uh, or access, I don't think any other report would suggest as much, because this was a report specifically targeted towards women, and with very limited account of Assam in those reports. Yeah, it's a dismal picture, and that is why we need to go through the literature of the time, which are rather premised in medical misogyny, and that might be one of the reasons why these were so much in circulation and need to be studied. Thank you.
So there's another question I see here from Anamika. Let me See, yeah. Could we argue that modern eco-friendly menstrual products are another form of capitalist co-option rather than genuine decommodification?
Uh, I Of course there are new products every day. It's marketed in a way that each one seems healthier than the other. Uh, uh, the marketing is done in a way that dump the one you are using and use this. Of course this is a capitalist strategy, isn't it? I mean, you are basically using the same kind of products, and I'm not sure how very different they are in terms of their elements. They say that these are very environment friendly, but again it's marketed in a way when somebody tells you that you need to dump the earlier ones, and ours is a more eco-friendly thing. I don't know how legitimate or how justified it is to directly jump into it, but it's marketed in a way that convinces you, and you look for all of this stuff, right? Like this it's almost like the bamboo straw. How eco-friendly, while having it in a plastic glass. So how much of it you are saving, and how much of the environment are you exposing more to danger or human infringement?
Yeah. So there's one question that actually came directly to me, but I think it's a clarification point around the question that Nuruddin asked earlier. I'll just try and summarize this question. So he's saying, what did the authors think about the narratives they were making? Did they think about it as a scientific narrative or cultural or religious? If they thought about it as scientific, what qualified it to be a scientific narrative? So he's wondering whether there was a certain definition of scientificity that might emerge from these kinds of documents, or was it not considered scientific, perhaps taken in a different direction altogether?
No, no, no. They did not start with this disclaimer that these are firmly rooted in biological knowledge and all of that. No, it just started. It starts as a narrative of women need to be women need to be careful. Women, just like I said, these are not scientific treatises. These were just manuals handed out. No, that lack of scientific knowledge is very apparent in their writings, but they also did not step up and declare it as such. Though those were more encoded in a sort of morality of the time, more of a moral code.
Hmm. Like kind of conduct literature of sorts,
Mhm.
perhaps, right? Uh, were they taken sometimes as a sort of document of science, even if that was not the intention? Do you
No,
think the reception was ever like that? Not really.
no, not science,
Right,
rule
right.
books. So whatever you
Hmm.
understand from that, rule books. So these are men,
Right.
upper caste men making rules for us. So of course, everything they say is true, has been true for ages. So,
Hmm.
we follow.
Right, right. Great. I think that brings us to the end of this session today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And it was so nice to see so many questions. It's not that it happens all the time. So I was very happy to see different inquiries that the talk generated. And I'm really sorry. I do apologize again for joining late. It was completely beyond my control. Okay, so it seems like there's a question from Sneha. Uh, Raktima, if you don't mind, do we take another question, a last question? Because I don't want to deprive anyone. That's why. Okay. Sneha, go ahead.
Hello, Raktima ma'am. I'm really sorry if I'm taking a lot of time, but Sneha this side. Um, so, not talking totally about, please correct me if I'm going off topic, but I just wanted to ask that since we are talking about taboos, we did talk about taboos, and I don't want to term it as taboo, but kind of a ritual that is being going on in Assam, that is the Tulonibia, right? And at that point of time, the girls are undergoing a lot of rituals, and at that point of time, I've seen. I personally haven't like seen them, but I've heard about them that they go through a lot of procedures where they are excluded from the house. They are not um, let enter to the house, and they are giving some food which are not as nutritious that we get, because when I had my first period, at that point of time I ate everything, and I didn't feel any problem in my period or my first period. So I think I had every nutrition that I wanted to. But at the point of time, I've seen a lot of girls from who are going through the ritual of Tulonibia, and they are feeling nauseous and they are complaining all the time that I don't feel like eating, I don't feel like going somewhere because the food which is tasteless and not so good for them, they are made to eat that because of rituals. So I just wanted to say that since we are having this generational gap, this ritual is going to continue. So how can we through literature, if I'm speaking, how can we through literature make a more inclusive and creative environment where they can actually have the nutritional things rather than following the rituals in this society, so that they can have the nutritional things which are actually needed in menstruation rather than following the rituals. So can you say something about that?
Yes, Neha, I cannot speak for the whole of Assam or what
Yeah.
is in individual spaces, individual homes. You said your own personal account. Um, what has, uh, of course, a lot of people now have done away with this observation of these rules. But then, to a lot of people, this also becomes a sort of status symbol. No, arranging that, we call it tulonibia. Yeah, of course you are right about that, which is a wedding, right? So if you're rich and privileged, you give your daughter that sort of, 1 day's limelight of, being dressed up as a bride. So now what I see is it has slowly transitioned into a kind of status symbol for people, for the few people who practice. It also does not depend on the person, like you rightly said. If I step into puberty, it's not on me to decide at that point of time. It's your families which decide. So in many corners of Assam, these rituals is still observed, but then a lot of people have done away with it, and that I think is a good thing. And when you narrate your personal experience, I recall mine. I ate boiled food for some 7 days. So yeah, that's what I remember. So I observed this, made to observe these rituals too. But I'm just happy to see that parents now know better, that it has more to do with a woman's health rather than subject her to all of this stuff which she's not comfortable with. So a lot, I see people doing away with it. So I think that's a good change that I have seen.
Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Again, I cannot speak for the whole of Assam here,
Yeah, truly.
people practicing, but yeah, there is also a good number doing away with it.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Sneha. So that I think is it. And thank you again, Roktima, for making time and doing this. It would have been, of course, so much nicer to have you come to our campus. I hope that happens sometime soon.
I hope so.
Uh, yeah, and it's very nice to see you. And
Thank you.
and I should also thank Tiashi, who held on to a lot of heavy duty work at the start because I couldn't come in time. I'm really sorry about that. Tiashi, Oniket, and perhaps Bikram, whoever helped in that initial first 5-10 minutes where I just had to be elsewhere. I do apologize again, but I hope we can continue the discussions about this. It's a very important topic, which has, of course, as we could see in the questions as well, a lot of currency in the society that we live in right now. And I'm sure some of these discussions are also discussions of public culture that need to happen outside of academic settings as well. And I really hope that happens. And it's wonderful that a paper like this generates that kind of discussion and prepares ground for more, not just academic, but also public awareness discussions about, the evolution, let's say, of menstrual taboos and the changing role of society, capitalism, patriarchy in the discourse formation around it. Thank you very much, and all of you have a good evening. Thank you, Roktima, again, for your wonderful talk.
Just take 1 minute. Thank you. And I thank your department. And I have been attending this colloquy for the past 2 years, and it's such a privilege to finally present a paper here. I see many of my students in this odd hour attending this session. So thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining. See you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye.